What is going on, everybody? Welcome to the 2023-2024 season finale of Studs and Duds, the most comprehensive NFL player review series on the internet. For those longtime viewers of the channel, I know you've been waiting for this one, so thank you for your patience. How this is going to work here for the finale, I'm going to be making 8 of these episodes over the coming weeks, doing them 4 teams at a time by division, as each division is fully eliminated from the playoffs. So we'll be getting through these in due time as the playoffs wrap up here. But before we do get started, as always, I like to let people that may be new to the series know what Studs and Duds is all about. And what you may not know is back in 2016, this channel got its start actually as a Madden channel, where I have a custom community roster where I go and edit the player ratings to be what are, in my opinion, more accurate and realistic. And then, I'd come on here and talk about what I was seeing in the games and why I made those changes. And while I no longer make Madden content on this channel, I do still do some rebuilds and stuff over on TFG Plays, my second channel, if you want to check that out. I do still make that roster and this series because it's a great way for me to do my research and stay on top of everybody around the league, but it's also a great way to convey and take a wide lens look at who the rising and falling players around the league are, who's trending up, who's maybe not playing so well for every single player around the NFL. And throughout this video, you're going to be seeing those Madden ratings going up or down. But I do want you to know that those changes do a pretty good job to reflect how I perceive these players in real life, and the changes certainly stem from me watching the film and doing my own research and analysis. But without further ado, I hope you guys enjoy. Please do hit that like button as we get into it, and let's get started. And our first division is going to be the NFC East. Certainly a surprise that with the Cowboys and the Eagles in here, this was the first division fully eliminated. But we will start with the Washington Commanders and their star, highest riser of the season. Pretty slim pickings with this team, if we're being honest, but it's going to be Sam Cosmi settling in at right guard here in year 3. And Commanders and Jags fans, I've figured it out why, for some reason in the back of my mind, I thought that Brandon Sheriff was 6'7". Well, Sam Cosmi, depending where you look, is listed at 6'7", and Cosmi is the predecessor to Brandon Sheriff. But that is noteworthy because you just don't see a lot of taller built linemen like this sliding inside and having success. And I was skeptical of the Commanders when they made the decision to play him at guard, but they have really made this the right call. And there's a reason not a lot of taller linemen play guard, because it's a position that requires even more play strength than the tackle position, because you're going against bigger, stronger interior defensive linemen. You're kind of more in a phone booth, the shorter areas. But at 6'7" or 6'6.5", whatever you want to say Cosmi is, it requires an incredible amount of core balance, raw strength, and just athletic ability in general to maintain that balance and keep a low pad level when you're playing on the inside, because if you don't, you're going to get annihilated losing that pad level battle that is so important. So it's really impressive for Cosmi, not just that he's been adequate or solid at guard, but he has been one of the best run blockers in the NFL at that right guard spot, which was not the beat on him coming out of Texas either. He was more of a fluid pass protector type than he was some excellent run blockers. So he's really developed in that regard at the next level, clearly has added play strength. That was his concern coming out of Texas. It's not a concern at this point. And the pass protection's been very good. You can see that tackle experience translate. It's not always perfect, but certainly their best kind of offensive lineman in general, and a building block for this team that desperately needs one. He's had a hell of a season, heading into a contract year next year. Could be due for a surprisingly high payday for some. Now, unfortunately, as we continue to talk about this offense, the Sam Howell experience has fallen off a cliff hard. there was a lot of promise early in the year with it being his first year as a starter. And I mean, he was leading the league in big time throws for a while. He ended up with a bunch of raw passing stats. And, when you saw a lot of those exciting flashes, you could live with him taking what was at a point in time on pace to being a record number of sacks and missing some throws and throwing some interceptions. But as the year has gone on, Sam Howell has gone from promising young draft sleeper to backup, needs to be benched, liability for his football team type of quarterback. And now with the Commanders having that second overall pick, it's essentially a lock that Sam Howell will have to kind of go back to being a backup and try to carve out a role somewhere, whether that's here or somewhere else in the future, and get better as a football player. But I mean, in the first 10 weeks of the season, Sam Howell had 24 big time throws. In the last 7 weeks, he had just 6. He ends up with a 21 touchdown, 21 interception season. You put that on top of the fact that he just takes an immense amount of sacks, took 65 sacks on the season. This thing has just fallen off a cliff. Now, I still think he's got tools. I think he can be a capable backup. And you certainly don't want to just say his career is over at 23 years old. But you really couldn't have drawn up a worse second half of the season for Sam Howell. A lot of people looked at like him and Jordan Love as like a similar level quarterback around that week 8 mark, being two guys that sort of sat and were in their effective rookie season, their first year as a starter, where both were showing flashes but were just very inconsistent. It couldn't have been any opposite in terms of Jordan Love getting better as the year went on, as opposed to Sam Howell that just went in the complete tank, which I think just puts a little interesting perspective on how big this fall off has been. On a positive note, though, the third string running back, Chris Rodriguez, a 5th round pick out of Kentucky, has gotten very minimal playing time, but has been extremely efficient when he's played. He is a tough, grinded out type. Weeks 15 and 16 got 10 carries in each of those games. Ended up with about 100 yards, couple touchdowns, over 4 yards after contact. So, they still have Brian Robinson ahead of him, but they're very similar style backs, and you can definitely mix in a few extra carries for Chris Rodriguez into the future. Now, we talked about how Sam Howell's had this disappointing second half of the season. Jahan Dotson's been one of the most underwhelming, disappointing players in the entire National Football League for the course of the season. And for Dotson to play every single game, but only end up with 49 catches, just over 500 yards, finishing 88th out of 95 eligible receivers in yards per route run. This goes beyond bad quarterback play. He's not coming down with tough catches. He's not winning early and separating. For a guy that showed immense flashes when healthy as a rookie and a guy that I really liked in the first round, it's been a disastrous second season, and you just hope that new coaching, new quarterbacking can get him back on the right track, because the talent and the athleticism, the route running, the ball skills, it's all there. He's just got to get out of his own head at this point. But he does need to come down in the ratings for it. And then one more piece on the offensive line before we talk about the defense. Andrew Wiley was brought in here to follow Eric Bieniemy over from Kansas City, and he has definitely settled in and continued to kind of get better at 29 years old. I think he's probably set as their starting right tackle next season, as they can hopefully focus on some other aspects of this roster, like this defense that, boy, this team has the drop-off with this defense is similar to what we've talked about with Sam Howell. It's pretty crazy to think about where we thought about this Commanders defense, just maybe 500 days ago, in terms of the D-line and the youth and the upside, being a well-coached defense by Ron Rivera and all that, and it's just gone. Like, as we look at this, it's not to say there aren't some guys playing well and going up, but literally nobody on the defensive line is going up. They've traded away their edge rushers. The guys that have stepped in have accomplished essentially nothing. The interior defensive line, you're not getting gains from Fedarian Mathis and Allen and Payne are fine and are kind of the two good pieces they really have left on this defense, but it's tough, man. They got to build this thing up. But the linebacker, Khaleke Hudson, is going to go up after they finally decide to use this guy. I mean, Ron Rivera, pardon my French, but what the fuck? Like, he's been around here. I think myself, who liked Khaleke Hudson in the draft, saw him go in the 5th round out of Michigan with a ton of athleticism and high-end plays. I think myself and a lot of Commanders fans wanted to see some more of Khaleke Hudson throughout the Ron Rivera era here. It isn't until the last month of the season where Khaleke Hudson gets 300 snaps starting in the last month of the year. He had hardly had 300 snaps in his career before that last month of the year, and he played really well. 18 defensive stops, 2 pass breakups, and a really impressive game against the Jets. 3 games with double-digit tackles. I mean, just flying around from that weak side linebacker position. This is an undersized guy at about 6 foot 220. But man, you definitely got to look at him and what he did and say, hey, like I said, why weren't we playing this guy more often instead of Gerard Mayo and Cody Barton? But also, his contract's up now. You wasted it. Now you're going to have to convince him to come back to this disastrous situation. Just completely botched. Khaleke Hudson, who I think could be an interesting potential, a guy that someone could look at and say, we love what we saw in the last 4 games of his rookie contract, where he didn't play at all before that. And, maybe this guy should at least be a starting weak side linebacker, if not a, number 2 type of guy. So someone to follow for sure. Finished really strong. Unfortunately, the rating just can't be that high, though, because he's only got 4 starts on his career. But then you go to the secondary here, and these 2 corners are going to come down, Benjamin St-Juste and Danny Johnson. Both in our last episode of Studs and Duds had just gone up. It looked like these guys were kind of settling in, and we're going to maybe be a couple pieces for them with the cornerback room, but not so much. Benjamin St-Juste had one of the worst second halves of the season of any cornerback in the league. He actually ended up finishing 2nd in the NFL in yards allowed. I like Benjamin St-Juste, but I feel like he is still best served as that kind of bigger-bodied slot corner. He's still very quick for a bigger guy and tackles really well, but you can just see the speed and coverage skills just don't really translate to the outside as well as you may have hoped there at midseason. And then Danny Johnson went right back to being that kind of depth piece. We raised him week 7. And then had a couple of bad outings against Philadelphia and Seattle weeks 8 and 10, and then got benched. So that's where you're at with him. Now, for what it's worth, with Danny Johnson kind of going back to the bench, Emmanuel Forbes did come in and I would say much more held up to his draft billing in the second half of the season. Now he's rated as a 72. I think that's still probably high for what his overall season performance looks like, but you definitely can be encouraged that the former first round pick might not be a bust. Now, with that said, it's tough because he was drafted specifically to play the scheme that Ron Rivera wanted to run with that kind of off zone pattern matching, quarter style defense, with Forbes being a lighter corner that plays well in space, but at 165 pounds can't really press and play physical coverage. We'll kind of have to see what type of defense they want to run and if Forbes can be a fit in that system. So it's just tough when you're drafting such a scheme dependent player with a top 16 draft pick, knowing you were probably going to fire your head coach. We'll have to monitor that whole situation. He's a fascinating guy to monitor here. But then into the safety room, Percy Butler did have a good second half of the year. He actually ended up playing almost 900 snaps this season. Really athletic project type of safety, but again, has played a ton at this point. Was a pretty consistent run defender with the exception of that Dallas game where he just had an overall awful day, the first Dallas meeting. He ended up getting hurt, missed the last couple games of the season. God, this team couldn't get anything right in the second half. He was starting to show some signs and then missed the last couple games. But between him and Jatavius Martin, who finished his season strong, he ended up finally starting. So many players where it's like, Ron, just play the young guys. It's not that hard. You spent a second-round pick on him with no real plan of how to use the guy. Turns out you put him out in there second half of the year. He's flying around, making tackles, gets a pick against Dak Prescott in the final game of the season. I like Jatavius Martin a lot, man. I like that pick when they made it, and it's been good to see him getting some playing time out here between these two guys and Derek Forrest, who's really cemented himself as a solid player here. I think you look at Cam Curl having a bit of a down year here in his contract fourth season, where his missed tackle rate tripled this season, gave up a career-high 3 touchdowns this year, the most yardage he's allowed since his rookie season at almost 400 yards. I think they'll pretty easily decide to let Cameron Curl go, and I don't want to paint like the most pessimistic outlook ever on Cam Curl, but this is a guy that now is going to have to head into free agency, coming off a pretty down year with a 7th round draft pedigree, not a great athlete. I wouldn't be surprised if he kind of tapers off here. Now, that's all I'm going to say about it. I certainly would never want to predict that about him. He's a smart player, physical player, and an instinctive guy. So I would love to see him land somewhere and rekindle his career. Not that he's been like a disaster this year or anything, but certainly has not been an impact player. We'll see what the market kind of values Cam Curl at here in a couple of months. But I do think that Washington's going to let this guy go because the safety room's in pretty good shape and they've got other areas of concern there. And then with the special teamers, Joey Sly was certainly not perfect this year, but was relatively average based on the rest of the league with kickers. So he's going to go up to, and then Tress Way at 33 years old was once viewed as one of the better punters in the league, but he actually was 30th in PFF grade for punting and has regressed year by year. So that's going to be reflected here. So there's your Commanders, a team that has a ton of work to do this offseason. Next up, we have the Dallas Cowboys, and man, between the Cowboys and the Eagles, I did not expect the NFC East to be the first episode here for the season finale, where we're waiting till the entire division is eliminated. What a frustrating close to the Cowboys season. Now, there's still a lot of good to talk about with the Dallas Cowboys. It was still a very successful regular season, even though their postseason really just choking efforts continue. But what a year it was for CeeDee Lamb, who I think did put himself into the elite group of wide receivers, which to me just includes Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, and A.J. Brown. And I think CeeDee Lamb has put himself in that with, the hands consistency has reached an elite level, just a few drops on the season. The run after catch ability that was so special at Oklahoma has translated to the next level. The route running has developed every year, and he's just become that full force featured alpha wide receiver this year where you really feel like he can hold up running the entire offense through him, short, intermediate, and deep, including the playoff game. CeeDee Lamb is going to finish the season here with 144 receptions, 1,860 yards, 12 touchdowns. He had 7 games with double-digit receptions. What's left to really say about CeeDee Lamb? But his quarterback 2 is going to go up. Now, I'm going to be honest, this would have been a +2 if we did this before the playoffs, because you cannot lie. It is certainly disappointing to see Dak Prescott, who we all agree is a really good quarterback and has been an amazing regular season quarterback at other points in his career too. But he just has had these ugly playoff stinkers, and the game against the Packers was no different, with just straight up bad plays, including a missed slant to CeeDee Lamb early in the game that helped them get behind the 8 ball. You have the brutal read that led to a pick six that basically put that game away, not to mention the lack of play extension and forcing things like a slant to Brandon Cooks when he's covered up on a third down. All of the criticisms of Dak Prescott showed back up in that playoff game. So again, that's why this is not a +2. But overall, Dak's season was the best of his career, and I still walk away impressed by Dak this season. If he didn't have the year he had during the regular season, I would probably be more coming out of that playoff game saying, this is a quarterback you should probably move on from. I don't feel that way about Dak Prescott. Yes, it was a stinker performance, and yes, you're incredibly frustrated about it, and we've been critical of him just now, a minute ago. But he did lead the NFL in big-time throws. He did lead the NFL in touchdown passes. He did have some of the most remarkable quarterback performances of the entire season. So I still walk away impressed by Dak with certainly a buzzkill at the end of the season there. You thought this year was going to be a little bit different there. Then we're going to show some love to Rico Dowdle, the backup running back. Played his role, really nothing sensational, not like super efficient or anything, but stepped in as a relief pitcher and made some catches out of the backfield, had some tough runs, took care of the football, everything you could, I suppose, ask for a whatever type of backup running back. But we are going to lower Brandon Cooks. Another one here, we lowered him in our last episode of Studs and Duds, just by one. Like, this is just incremental regression that we're seeing from Brandon Cooks. This is the lowest season of his career in yards per route run, and I know we had some good games, down the stretch here, and that's what you expect out of a wide receiver too. But I think, especially when you talk about, like, there's just not that real vertical explosiveness that we've seen from Brandon Cooks in years past. He is getting up there in age. You also see him kind of getting, bodied around the line, picked off against Jair Alexander. He's not like a big physical number 2 wide receiver. Like, he certainly is not the perfect sort of number 2 option that maybe he was a couple years ago. Still a very good one, but I do think it's right, especially as we head into next year, that he comes down 1. But Jake Ferguson is going to go up. Was critical of this team for spending a second-round pick on Luke Schoonmaker when I didn't think they needed it. I thought Jake Ferguson showed plenty. He takes that job and runs with it. Has been one of the most productive tight ends on the season. You see that incredible catch in that Packers playoff game where he's just going up over 3 defenders, not like mossing them, but just showing the toughness in the middle of that zone and the ability to secure that catch through contact. So impressive. He's been so reliable in the short game. He's got that nice kind of shiftiness right after the catch to kind of turn up field, understand angles, how to make that first guy miss, get a few extra yards. He's a really nice possession tight end, and kind of the next in line in that role after, obviously, Jason Witten, but then Dalton Schultz, and now Ferguson. And then let's talk about the offensive line. It was a really good year for this offensive line from left tackle to right guard. Right tackle, not so much. We'll talk about that. But Tyron Smith staying healthy, having a career year in pass protection, but it is that health and consistency that just has not been there for Tyron Smith. But just so good to see him be able to stay on the field. And I think, being able to play like himself again, because even when he's played in years past, it hasn't quite been what he showed this year. So really encouraging to see that for a guy that you felt like maybe this guy was another year of being banged up away from retirement. Now, he missed a couple games in there, but he played over 900 snaps this season, made it to the playoffs. He hasn't done that since 2018. So big year for the 33-year-old all-pro left tackle. And then let's stay on the positive note with his running man, Tyler Smith, who might be his long-term replacement at left tackle. But in the meantime, Tyler Smith, I think, was voted first-team All-Pro, if not second-team All-Pro this season. I would certainly rank him with one of the 3 or 4 most remarkable, just highlight reel blockers, if you will, similar to, Trent Williams in San Francisco. Tyler Smith is just so fast off the ball at 330 pounds, has that mean streak, so many incredible impact blocks down the field, but he's really settled in as a pass protector as well. which is super impressive because I thought his technique was all over the place. But coming out of a small school, he's gotten good coaching for the first time, and he's very quickly responded to it. So, the sky really is the limit for Tyler Smith, whether that is at guard or tackle in the long run. And then even the center, Tyler Biadasz, in his contract, 4th season here, just continues to settle in, build a little play strength, just so many reps under his belt now. And his pass protection consistency, especially in the last 2 months of the season, has been the best in his career. So I don't know if Dallas is going to be able to lock him up, if another team will view him as like a quality starter or just a decent starter, but should be headed towards a decent payday given the amount of starts he's had in his career, and he's held up pretty well this year. But then the right tackle, Terrence Steele, has been an issue for the Dallas Cowboys. It's kind of the classic, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And he's been one of the worst pass protecting tackles in the NFL. And that's not like incredibly surprising for a guy that was an undrafted free agent that really got paid off of his run blocking efficiency after just being okay as a pass protector. But he has regressed. Not just as a pass protector, where he's gone from average to poor this season, but he has not had as many dominant blocks down the field this year either. So he's looking like a bit of an overpay for Dallas. It was interesting, the timing of when they paid him, because I felt like he hadn't fully established himself yet based on the price they gave him, and they're going to really need to hope he can get back to what he was a year ago if he's going to live up to what they're paying him. But then you flip over to the defensive side of the ball, and man, I've given this front office a ton of credit for being an underrated drafting team, and I loved the Mazie Smith pick. I thought this was going to be a missing piece for a team that needed some physicality and help in run defense up front, and Mazie Smith has just not been that this year. He's really struggled in the run game. And, one of the concerns for him at Michigan was that he didn't take on double teams as well as you might hope, just in his technique at Michigan. And getting to the pro level, that just, the technique hasn't improved, and he's really giving up a ton of ground in the run game. He's not getting off blocks like he did at Michigan, where I thought his just raw block shedding ability one-on-one was incredible. You're not seeing that show up. He's got like only 7 defensive stops on the entire season, I think. If he's shown any signs of life, it's as a pass rusher. He had a really nice sack against Baltimore. And this is a position that it's very challenging to expect year one impact from a defensive tackle, especially in terms of run defense. But I did think Mazie Smith was going to be different in that regard, and unfortunately he has not been. So I'm not giving up on him, but he definitely has to come down. And then case in point why it's difficult to expect a defensive tackle to be good in run defense right away. Neville Gallimore was a 3rd-round pick 4 years ago and has been nothing short of a liability for the Cowboys. He's been a big reason why the Cowboys needed to spend a 1st-round pick on Mazie Smith. But he has at least settled into his role as a rotational defensive tackle. He's had some good pass rush reps. He's had some good run defense reps. Wouldn't be stunned if the Cowboys make him a cheap 1-year offer to kind of see if he can come back and continue his development track. Then you get to the 2nd level, and there's just like not a whole lot of players to talk about for the Cowboys. You do have Damone Clark, who I think has been okay after we raised him in the last episode of Studs and Duds. But beyond that, they just play a bunch of defensive backs there, including Marquise Bell, who's officially listed as a linebacker. I mean, look, he's 205 pounds. He's still a safety at heart. And ultimately, as the year went on, we saw teams really start to attack this team on the ground. And the Packers in the playoff game were no different there. And having a 205-pound linebacker who was an undrafted safety out of Florida A&M a year before, is going to show some issues in run defense. But when the Cowboys were able to build a lead and get that game script that was so favorable for this defense, where they let the pass rush pin their ears back, they were able to put Marquise Bell in there at linebacker and run sideline to sideline and cover ground and make plays in coverage. He's been good in that role. So overall, he's had a good season. Is he actually a linebacker? No, it's a very unique scheme thing there. but technically by the formational alignment, he has been a linebacker overall, though. Good year for Marquise Bell. Very consistent tackling ability, just 6.5%. Missed tackle rate there. Actually ended up the year with like 80 tackles, 34 defensive stops. So some pretty big numbers for him. Now, as we look down the board a little bit here with Jaron Kearse, we might as well talk about these guys back to back. Jaron Kearse, on the other hand, saw his missed tackle rate triple this year. He's been one of the more remarkably consistent tacklers in the league over the last couple of years, sitting around 3%. His missed tackle percentage jumped up to 11 this year. He also had a low in pass breakups at just 3 on the season, where he's had 5 and 10 the year before that. So he's 30 years old now. I believe he's in a contract year. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised as this team looks to next year, especially if Bill Belichick's going to be their coach, with Marquise Bell kind of stepping in for Jaron Kearse as more of that box safety role. And I would actually really like to see that, because Belichick has done, I'm getting way ahead of myself assuming they hire Bill Belichick. Mike McCarthy hasn't even been fired yet. But if it happens, you heard it here first, that Marquise Bell could have a career year in that sort of Adrian Phillips box safety dime linebacker role that Belichick has really made a signature around the league lately. But let's move to the very back end with these cornerbacks, and let's talk about Deron Bland, who's going to get a +3 here. He's gotten a ton of love in Studs and Duds this year. But that said, Cowboys fans are probably going to say this is not enough for the player that was voted in as a first-team All-Pro, led the NFL in interceptions and pick sixes, broke the record for pick sixes in a season. And I'm not saying that those individual plays weren't remarkable. I'm not even saying he didn't deserve to be like a first-team All-Pro, as he was. But this is a flawed cornerback, and it's always a sticky, difficult conversation when you talk about those interceptions numbers, because for the most part, those are the most tangible digits that you can look at for a corner. But he was 16th in yards allowed. And in the last really 2.5 months of the season, he had 2 or 3 really brutal performances, maybe none worse than his wild card game against the Packers, where he was nowhere to be found. But he ends up 16th in the NFL in 16th most in the NFL in yards allowed for cornerbacks, which isn't horrible, but it certainly is not good. The reality of this situation is just interceptions are very fluid, and surprise, surprise, in the last 7 games of the season, when the interceptions stopped coming, his production and grades and how you felt about Deron Bland went down. And as instinctive as he is, as great ball skills as he has, it's just really difficult to project a guy to get 6, 7, 8, 9 interceptions in a season to make up for the blemishes of some of these really bad games in terms of coverage consistency. So Cowboys fans are familiar with this conversation because it's the exact same thing we said about Trayvon Diggs. It's crazy that we're right back here and that next year it's going to be Bland and Trayvon Diggs. Now, what Trayvon Diggs has done is continue to get better and settle in. And even though his picks numbers have gone down, his coverage consistency has gone up. And I think higher of Trayvon Diggs now than I did of when he came into the league and had 11 picks or whatever. Because, look, those 11 picks are good plays, but those are, or at least, the 9 picks in Deron Bland's case, those are really great plays, and he gets credit for that. But those are 9 snaps out of 1,020 total snaps on the season, right? 614 coverage snaps. That's under 1.5% of his total coverage snaps are the ones where he's getting interceptions. So to only evaluate him off of that is just pretty crazy. So I know this has a negative connotation. I like Deron Bland. He's been super impressive. I love his first step and his instincts and his ball skills. And he even has good coverage games out there too, for sure. But I'm not going to just project this guy to be an all-pro corner every year when the film just doesn't really say that about him. I think 79 heading into next year is a good middle ground there for a rating for Deron Bland. And then the rest of these guys, Jordan Lewis, I think any Cowboys fan will back this up. He just wasn't much of a player, was consistently getting attacked in coverage, not a whole lot of ball production, just 4 pass breakups despite getting targeted 74 times. Gave up a bunch of yards, 609 on the season, surrendered 4 touchdowns to just 1 interception. Was good in run defense down the stretch, but overall just really looked like a backup and needed to get dinged here. And then Stephon Gilmore, not that he was horrible. I think he was pretty good, but we did have him rated quite high. He had a career high in yards allowed this year. Technically, his rookie year, he allowed 2 more total yards, but 734 yards allowed was the most he's allowed really by far since 2012, so 11 years ago. The dude's just getting up there in age, right? He's 33 years old. It's tough to hang on that long as a high-end corner. Again, he had a lot of good performances, but down the last month of the season, the Packers game, the Dolphins game, just not quite at that level of an 85 grade that we had on him there. So he's going to come down too, and I think he's probably gone in Dallas here with Bland playing well and with Diggs coming back next year. Still could, I think, be a decent number 2 corner for someone, but he had to be their number 1 this year, right? And then you got Brandon Aubrey, the kicker. It's been one of the pleasant surprises of this Cowboys team this year. Really has been kind of like a all-pro or Pro Bowl level kicker for Dallas. What a fun story he's been, kind of coming off the couch to be an NFL kicker, and a damn good one at that. But then we have the Philadelphia Eagles, and you'll be hard-pressed to find another week where a team has this many players falling in the ratings, but it is just this extreme circumstance where they've had this catastrophic season. They didn't really come all that close to living up to their own hype and Super Bowl expectations, getting blown out by the Bucs in the first round of the playoffs, and losing to teams like the Cardinals down the stretch in the regular season. But you also have a lot of veterans on this team that I think are seeing a lot of age regression too. So it's not going to be a super positive conversation on this Eagles team. But let's start on a positive note with their star of the season, their biggest riser, Jalen Carter, who, while he didn't sustain that unbelievable elite production he had in the first 6 weeks of the season, something I put a little caution against considering the offensive lines they went against in that first, 6-week stretch. He has cooled off in terms of not being literally the best pass rusher in the NFL, which those first 6 weeks kind of had him at. But he's still been consistently getting multiple pressures every week. He finished with 7 sacks as a rookie, was the highest graded defensive player for the Eagles per PFF on the season. And additionally, there were questions, legitimate questions, about the off-field and the character stuff, but he has definitely put those to bed. You don't really hear about them anymore. He's stayed out of trouble and has put his head down and been an excellent player out the gate in the NFL. It seems like this was a draft pick well worth it for the Eagles and can be a cornerstone building block for their defense moving forward. That said, just a +1 for this episode where it's basically weeks 8 through the wild card round. And we'll see what next year looks like for him. He did go up against a lot of bad offensive lines, and his best games came in those games. Games like New England, Miami, the Giants. 17 of his 50 pressures of the season came in those games. And there were some days where he disappeared, including that wild card game against Tampa Bay. So he's going to have to continue to get better, just as any young player like Jalen Carter would have to. But I do think he has it in him, and continue to climb the ranks towards, kind of being the next Jeffrey Simmons, Quinnen Williams, which were a lot of the comps on him. I think he's well on his way towards that. Quinnen Williams wasn't great when he came into the league. Jalen Carter's been great. But we got to have some negative conversations here. Let's start with A.J. Brown, who is going to come down too. Now, he's still a net positive on the season. I think he's a +3 or 4 on the season still. But really, since the last episode of Studs and Duds here, where he was the star of the month and we were raving about, is he the best wide receiver in the NFL? Really, since then, that incredible streak of 6 straight games of 100 yards, just mossing dudes left and right with contested catches, the explosive plays where he did look like an elite player. Really, since we praised him for that, he hasn't been anything close to that. He's had drops. He's had games like the game against Kansas City where he's getting put in a box against L'Jarius Sneed. His contested catch percentage has fallen off a cliff, winning just 3 out of 12 looks on contested catches. So this is not to slam A.J. Brown. It is more of a pump the brakes on A.J. Brown being this star destroyer of a wide receiver that can't be stopped. Because in the second half of the year, he really was, I'm not going to say stopped, but certainly slowed down relative to what he was doing earlier. So it's much more of a reaction to the boost we gave him in the last time we did this series. But one thing you also noticed about the Eagles, and you'll see here, I'm not dropping Jalen Hurts. I think the injury is a big part of it. And a lot of you guys know I didn't see him as this top 5 incredible quarterback to begin with. I think he's playing much closer to how I thought he would coming into the year, but you put the injury on top of that, it really has hurt his game. So I'm not going to drop Jalen Hurts. I still think he actually played really well on the season, even though he did really struggle in that game against Tampa. But one thing you do notice about the Eagles is, whether it's A.J. Brown not being dominant or him being gone in that Tampa Bay game, you really felt that these other pieces just weren't really stepping up and really weren't doing a ton. And that includes Olamide Zaccheaus, who was supposed to be this kind of fun slot option, a tough cover and an explosive guy after the catch. And he was a complete jag, adjusted guy. He had some better seasons in Atlanta, but that is not the player we saw here in Philadelphia this year, despite getting a pretty good opportunity to be that guy. There's also Julio Jones, who's rated down as a 73. Didn't think it was necessary to drop him, but worth noting that's the level Julio Jones is playing at these days. Dallas Goedert actually has been, an above average, but nothing more than that tight end this year. Talk about contested catch win rate. He's been like a 60% guy. He's been super reliable throughout his career for Jalen Hurts. 65% averaging out the last 2 seasons. A career low 40% this year, and a career low in yards per route run. So he just hasn't been dynamic for them. He's going to come down. And even Devontae Smith was a little bit week to week this year. So it's something the Eagles are going to have to look at. I think they could benefit from investing in a very deep wide receiver class. Remember, I think they still have the Saints' second-round pick this year from that whole trade scenario from several years ago. So they got some capital to make that happen in a good wide receiver class. But then Jason Kelce, I'm going to lower him just in case he changes his mind and doesn't retire here, but not playing up to quite his best center in the NFL standards from a year ago, still towards the top of the league. I'd much rather spend this time celebrating Jason Kelce, who it does sound like at 36 years old, he's going to retire. And just first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the more memorable offensive linemen of the really generation, considering he's played for 14, 15 years or whatever it is. One of the most athletic offensive linemen you'll ever see. I think outside of Trent Williams, you'd be hard-pressed to find a more impressive career highlight reel than Jason Kelce. And even including Trent Williams, Jason Kelce's speed for such a big human. He's a smaller offensive lineman, but he's still huge. The fact that he can move the way he has been such a weapon for the Eagles and is so exciting. But off the field too, with his leadership, the personality has been fantastic. Even before the Kelce and Kelce podcast, he's been a likable character. So Jason Kelce, sounds like the Eagles are going to have to move on without him. And that's going to be an adjustment for that offensive line, to say the least, and that locker room. But let's flip over and back to the defense. There are some other interior defensive linemen that have stepped up this year. Just a quick shout for Marlon Tuipulotu, who's going to go from a 67 to a 68, becoming a better role player for them. He's got a couple sacks on the season. He's had, I think, 11 defensive stops. He's been a decent rotational player. thought he was a solid pick out of USC. He's been okay. And then Fletcher Cox actually has had the best year he's had since probably like 2019, honestly. It's just insane that he continues to play 40-plus snaps a game at 30 years old. He plays both ways, run defense and pass rush. Now, he leaned a little bit more towards pass rush snaps than run defense snaps this year, but, 50 pressure, 8 sack season. He put up like number 1 defensive tackle numbers this year. Was one of the few defensive players that decided to show up against Tampa Bay as well. And a lot of his best performances came down the stretch in this season when their team was kind of starting to spiral a little bit. Fletcher Cox, I think, dug deep and showed a lot of leadership. So I don't think he's done. He's 33 years old. We'll see what he decides to do if he wants to come back to Philadelphia. I know he signed that cheap 1-year deal to come back. But another one of these key locker room presences that is going to be a question mark for the Eagles heading into the offseason. But then Hassan Reddick, I'm going to lower him one. He's one of these guys similar to like even Deron Bland and Trayvon Diggs, where the box score is always going to look pretty good for Hassan Reddick because he's such an incredible athlete. And when he does win, he's really efficient at converting his wins into sacks because he's one of the fastest, bendiest, most explosive edge rushers in the league. So when he does win, more often than not, he is getting home. And there's certainly value to that. And he's still an 85 rating here, and that's well-deserved. He's still a great pass rusher, but he's 33rd in the NFL in pass rush win rate. His total pressures on the season have been, with 80 more pass rush snaps, mind you, have dropped down by about 30%. He had 87 pressures last year. That resulted in 21 sacks. This year, 68 pressures to 13 sacks. And the last 3 weeks of the season, just 2 total pressures, no sacks. Very much disappeared when this team needed him to step up. It's a slight ding here, but it's to take him further away from those truly game-wrecking pass rushers that you can truly count on to get you a bucket. And Hassan Reddick, while he's a great player, doesn't have the full package to really count on him to win those big matchups. And I think some Eagles fans are probably coming around to that after the season he had this year. There's definitely still going to be some loud Hassan Reddick apologists as well, and that's good and well. I understand what I'm getting into by criticizing a guy that's got about 60 sacks in the last 4 seasons, but it is what it is. That's my stance on it. Let's get to the second level with the linebackers. Man, this team really is hoping that Kobe Dean can stay healthy. I also think that they're actually going to finally invest in linebackers here from Howie Roseman because this whole process just did not work out. Nicholas Moreau as well, who was serviceable most of the season, but in the last month looked like dog water. We're not going to lower him because he's only 71. He did have a decent total season, but Zach Cunningham, I like this signing when they made it, but he is not the old Zach Cunningham. He can't really move all that well at this point in his career. You can see it in his missed tackles. He's tripping all over himself. He can't get in the backfield like he once did, and the coverage just so tough to watch from Zach Cunningham. Injuries have really followed Cunningham around, and he wasn't really ever this sensational athlete to begin with. So he definitely needs to be in kind of a specific role as just kind of a run defending specialist at this stage in his career, as opposed to the 3-down starter that Philadelphia asked him to be. A pretty clear choice to drop him down. And then this secondary, talk about this team needing to direct some attention in the offseason to fixing. 3 veterans here dropping in the cornerback room alone: Darius Slay, James Bradbury, and Bradley Roby, who they picked up as a Band-Aid midseason. I mean, age comes for these guys, man. It's an athletic-based position, and all these guys, it hit them at the wrong time. Darius Slay has had one of the worst years of his career. Granted, still a serviceable player that can have some highlight plays, Like, I'm not trying to say he's completely busted, but he's not the superstar corner that he was the last 2 years for Philadelphia. They needed him to be that because they just didn't have a whole lot of other answers. He was banged up this year as well. So, I mean, he's 33 years old, right? This isn't a huge surprise. It's just unfortunate the Eagles didn't really have a plan in place for if this were to be the case. On top of that, James Bradberry hit the regression wall at 30 years old as well. And Bradberry is one of these guys that he's a total like ball hawking zone corner, and we saw some of those flashes this year. But I think on one hand, his like down in down out coverage consistency did fall off quite a bit this year. That much was obvious. But I think he also was hurt by the pass rush and the D line up front not being as dominant as they were the year before, because that's when you're able to, force mistakes out of quarterbacks and speed up their processes, where you would kind of see their hesitation or see them panic and, jump balls and stuff like that. But, he goes down to giving up 10 touchdowns this season, almost 800 yards allowed, was the 7th most yards allowed on the entire season. We saw that defense fall off, and Bradberry and Slay's coverage on the back end was honestly a very significant part of that, and that's a spot where I don't think Eagles fans would really deny that. And then Bradley Roby just, they picked him up off the street. He was just very week to week. He can still, be a Band-Aid, and you can hope to get a good week out of him, but just not a very sticky coverage player at this point. Someone that has definitely leaned into his athleticism throughout his career. Now that he's getting up there towards 30 years old, has gone through some injuries. I don't think he quite has that crutch, and as just not as consistent as he once was. So all those veterans going down. I will say Kelee Ringo did play in the last kind of 5 games or so on the season, and it certainly was not perfect. I mean, Kelee Ringo, I think, he shouldn't have fallen to the 4th round, but he definitely was never a first-round prospect, like some people said. Like, you watched his Georgia tape and you saw a lot of inconsistency, and that's still there. Like, he had some bad moments when he did start, or at least got playing time here in Philadelphia, like when he first stepped on the field against Dallas, or that Cardinals game, gave up a pretty tough touchdown where he just wasn't seeing the route develop, but still had some good plays. Had an interception against the Giants, had a nice pass breakup against the Seahawks. I think he showed some flashes. I don't know that you look at him as a starter next year. I don't think it's the craziest thing if they might think he can take that leap. He also was just exactly like he was at Georgia, an awesome presence as a run defender and a secure tackler. I was never opposed to Kelee Ringo being a safety in the NFL for that reason. But definitely piqued my interest a little bit with how he played at the end of the year. Also worth noting, by the way, he had 4 penalties on 134 coverage snaps. That's quite a lot. That was definitely on his Georgia tape as well. So some up, some down, but he is going to get a +1 for some solid playing time down the stretch. Then you look at the safety room, and I didn't think we'd be here at the end of the year saying this, but the Kevin Byard trade wasn't really all that great for the Eagles. Not like you totally regret it or anything, but there really has not been much of a difference between Terrell Edmunds when he was playing and Byard when he got here. Both are really secure tacklers and good run defenders, especially around the box, but neither really anywhere to be found in terms of coverage. Byard, I think, played it very safe. He was not really credited with a ton of yards allowed or anything. Did get credited for 2 touchdowns allowed in his time in Philadelphia, but just 1 pass breakup in his time here. Tied a career high in penalties, so, a little bit out of position at times, reaching and grabbing to stay in coverage a little bit too much. And just watching the Eagles play, while he is a physical presence and a really secure tackler, there were a couple games where, like the Arizona game, for example, he just wasn't getting to the ball against the run, taking bad angles or just looking a little bit slow back there. It's interesting. Like, I don't think Bayard sucks. I think he's still a really good safety. I think he's really heady and physical, and the tackling consistency is a big part of the position back there, right? He's also in a completely different system here. But very clearly, I had him rated at a 91 when the Eagles traded for him. He's not a game-changing safety right now. I mean, he wasn't for Tennessee. They traded him away. He hasn't been for the Eagles. He's on the other side of 30 at this point. So it's a tough balance always. I'm not saying he sucks. There are areas where he's not what he once was. But then the other safety, Sidney Brown, the rookie third-round pick, has stepped into the lineup in the last couple of months, and he looks good. He's made some plays in coverage. He had that pick against the Cardinals that you love to see, the speed, the pick six in that one. But for me, the most encouraging thing about Sidney Brown is his tackling ability relative to how bad he was at Illinois. This was really why he fell. Was he missed almost 1 out of 4 tackles at Illinois. It was like he was literally maybe the worst tackling safety I've ever evaluated, at least a draftable one. Was just this one clear knock on him. And in his 334 snaps this season in 13 games, he is missing 1 out of 10. So that's a massive improvement. He's taken that to heart. And when he's not missing tackles, you can see he can fly downfield. He had 11 defensive stops on the season, and he can make some plays in coverage. So I like Sidney Brown quite a lot, and that was the big weakness on him. It's really good to see him starting to clean that up. Curious to see what kind of role they have for him next year, because Kevin Byard isn't particularly expensive. After that trade, I don't know that they would cut Kevin Byard. Reed Blankenship is set to return. That's a big reason why Sidney Brown was getting starting reps in the first place. So there's not a clear starting role for Sidney Brown, but he can play somewhere and probably should be. So we'll see how that plays out. And then we'll end this with the kicker, Jake Elliott, who had kind of an all-pro type of season. I mean, the man missed 3 kicks all year, a PAT, and then 1 from 50 plus, 1 from 40 plus. That's all you need to know. He had, he won them that Bills game, making a 59-yarder in pouring rain. I mean, the dude is incredible. He was probably better than any kicker in the NFL, including Justin Tucker this year. And then we wrap up with the New York Giants, whose star of the season, the most impressive, highest riser of the year for the New York Giants, can be nobody other than Dexter Lawrence. I mean, he has truly entered the elite conversation for not just defensive tackles, but defensive players. Like, I think he was slept on as a defensive player of the year candidate because the Giants weren't all that special this year, but his impact in both phases of the game, against the run, against the pass, were just ridiculous this year. He ends up as the 3rd graded interior run defender per PFF. He ended up 13th in defensive stops, but if you look up the charts at a lot of those leaders in defensive stops, many of them played a lot more snaps than Dexter Lawrence, and he was just 1 behind a 3-way tie for 10th place. So the stats are there. The grading profile is there. We know the presence that he has as one of the rare monster starting, like 3-down starter, just nose tackle types. And for him to play over half of his snaps really over the center, where it's so easy to double team that guy and you really have to double team that guy, yet for him to still make such an impact against the run. A lot of times these guys will just swallow up blocks and it'll open up guys for, I don't know, maybe guys like Micah McFadden and Bobby Okereke, who are going to go up later here in this conversation. But a lot of times, like maybe Vita Vea is a good example of this. These bigger guys will do a really good job in that role, but you won't see them up there in terms of defensive stops. And like Vita Vea is probably the next best at this. He was 20th in the league in defensive stops. But there's a whole bunch of other nose tackles that really just are maybe impacting and making plays in the backfield 10 times on a season at that size. So that's rare. But then you get into what he did as a pass rusher. where he was the highest graded pass rushing interior player in the league per Pro Football Focus. And he had 3 or 4 of the most dominant interior performances that any player had on the entire season. He's got enough foot speed to pull off some swim moves and work around blockers, but incredible get off to pair with his size and power rush and push the pocket. He's a special player, man. Deserves all of his flowers and probably more. You just hope that the Giants can put a little bit more talent around him in this front seven so you can really reap the benefits of what he's bringing to the table for this defensive line. But we'll revisit some of this defense momentarily, but let's talk about the offense, starting with Tommy DeVito, who had his, kind of run here in that middle part of the season after our latest episodes of Studs and Duds. And, what a fun run that was for Tommy Cutlets. And I'm not going to lie, man, he was relatively impressive for an undrafted free agent rookie. We had to go ahead and create him here in the Madden roster, putting him at a 65 mark. I think he can continue to get better. Obviously, he's just a rookie, and if he plays at the level he did for the majority of that run, I think he could be a decent backup, not just here for the next couple of years of his rookie contract, but really into the league. I mean, he has that skill set where he can kind of make some plays with his feet, but also run the structure of the offense when it's there. I was, again, relatively impressed by Tommy DeVito. Just not a whole lot of physical traits and explosiveness at the position to say this guy could ever be a starter. But what a run for Tommy Cutlets. And then for these wide receivers, we're going to drop a couple of these vets, especially Sterling Shepard, who I think it's I always feel bad when I say this, but it's probably time for Sterling Shepard to hang up the cleats. Towards the bottom in the league in terms of yards per route run. He's had drops. He's continued to struggle to stay healthy. His body has really betrayed him these last 3 or 4 years. He's like the NFL version of that guy for the Miami Hurricanes that just came out, that he's entering his 9th year of college football or whatever. And he's had 4 medical redshirt years. It feels like Sterling Shepard has suffered that in the NFL. And Paris Campbell's a fairly similar story. He ended up getting banged up again this year. That's been the book on him throughout his career as a second-round pick out of Ohio State. But even when he played in the first half of the year, it was just really inefficient. Not a whole lot of juice or explosiveness there from him. So he didn't really help their wide receiver room as they were hoping. So he's going to come down. Now, Wan'Dale Robinson has been able to get healthy here, especially into the second half of the year. He's gotten out there. What he did in that Packers game was sensational, but he's been very consistent despite a few drops. But in terms of his ability to separate and be available for the quarterback, to not just the quick game either. He's been getting open down the field in this Brian Dable scheme. So he's a nice piece for them. They just need higher upside players and bigger receivers around him. But now we got to talk about this offensive line. Now on a plus side, they picked up Tyree Phillips, who actually does remind me a little bit of one Jermaine Illuminor, who has had a very Tyree Phillips here has had a very similar career trajectory here. Illuminor was a mid-round pick by, you guessed it, the Baltimore Ravens. He ends up going to New England and turns into a kind of starting caliber tackle around year 3 or 4 of his career. Also a bigger bodied guy, about 330 pounds, that had kind of been projected as a guard at times. And there's just eerily familiar signs that this could be Tyree Phillips. So there's some signs of life here for the Giants at that right tackle spot, but they're hoping that can be Evan Neal in year 3. And to make even more ties there, the Giants just signed Carmen Brasillo, who worked with Jermaine Illuminor in Las Vegas and really cemented him as a starting right tackle. So between Tyree Phillips and Evan Neal, who really didn't play in the second half of the year, I think they could settle in at a good right tackle. And Tyree Phillips really came in. They picked him up off of, I think, the Eagles practice squad around week 7. And he just started at right tackle and wasn't perfect. He had some hiccup games, got beat pretty bad by Rashawn Gary in that Packers game. But, for what they were getting from right tackle, he was much better. And I think they're at least feeling somewhat optimistic at that right tackle spot with the addition of Phillips and Brasillo. relative to how they felt at about the week 7 mark when Evan Neal was a turnstile and they didn't have Tyree Phillips. But beyond that, they have so much to work on here. Their guard situation is a nightmare, where you have Justin Pugh, who they picked up off the street and really showed why he was available on the street. Now he played at kind of a replacement level for them. He had some games that were better than others, but he's definitely fallen off a cliff from the player he once was, and even from that little resurgence he had in Arizona. Coming back to New York here, he has really struggled for the most part. And then Mark Glowinski, the fact that Justin Pugh was starting over him goes to tell you how they feel about him. Now, what's interesting about Glowinski is, number one, he's getting paid a lot of money, or at least has been the last couple of years. I think at this point he's a clear-cut candidate for the Giants. But he actually is graded out okay per PFF after week 1, where he received a pass block grade of 1. And that came against the Cowboys, where they obviously put a lot of stress on any offensive line with that pass rush. So this will be interesting to monitor here. I think it's more likely than not that he just is not good, and the Giants have seen him in practice and know that he's not a good answer for them, despite when he has played a few games, he's graded out okay. We're going to drop him 5. I think he's likely to hit the market. I will call this now. I predict that the Indianapolis Colts pick him up on the cheap, and he steps in at right guard, is an upgrade from Will Fries for them, and he rounds out what could be one of the best offensive lines in the league next year. Mark Glowinski was really good for the Colts, got him a contract with the Giants here, where he's obviously faded away. So just a little fun prediction there. We'll see if that comes true. But unfortunately, I got to hold my hand up and say it looks like I was wrong about John Michael Schmitz being this really good, kind of like almost... I stayed shy of comparing him outright to Creed Humphrey. I think I actually compared him to more of the Bills center, Mitch Morse. But regardless of my pro comp, I thought John Michael Schmitz as a 4-year starter for Minnesota, and was very consistently one of the best offensive linemen in the Big Ten all of those years. I thought he would step in, and even with horrible guard play next to him, I thought he could, hold up really well as a center out the gate. But it just hasn't been the case. Now, I do think you have to emphasize the just merry-go-round of guards. It was like every other week he had someone different next to him, and that really challenges your ability in the run game to have that chemistry. Like, that's a thing for offensive linemen. I know when I was playing back in high school, like, I loved like certain tight ends and certain guards when they would play next to me, because you kind of get a feel for those combo blocks, where to strike, when to peel off. It really matters there, and that definitely hurts John Michael Schmitz, or hurt him this year as a run blocker, and that works in pass protection as well. Obviously, double teams, but even more importantly, like stunts. And for a rookie center, it would help to have consistent veterans at your right and left to kind of point out certain things and help you out. So I still believe in John Michael Schmitz, but it was a really disastrous rookie season for him, and certainly hasn't hit the ground running like I thought he would. But let's flip over to the defense now. And again, a guy I really liked in the draft has definitely not had the second season that you would hope for. Now, this is one of those things where you look at the raw box score. Kayvon Thibodeau did end up kind of walking into double-digit sacks, but 4 of those sacks came against Sam Howell, who's known for literally walking into sacks. He also ended up with 3 sacks against that garbage Jets offensive line. So you pair some of that context with the fact that he only had 44 pressures. That's actually less total pressures that he had last year on about 50 less snaps. He is all the way down into the 100 rankings in terms of pass rush win rate on the year. Really, his production comes from unblocked looks or tackles that can't quite get the depth to handle his speed. That's still an aspect to his game. But a lot of it comes on quarterbacks rolling out of the pocket contain rushes or stunts. There's not really a whole lot of Kayvon Thibodeaux lining up, beating guys one-on-one. And I really thought into year 2, we would see a lot more of that growth, and it's actually probably gone backwards. So I hate to do it. I still believe in his long-term upside, but I definitely need to drop Kayvon Thibodeaux, who's, looking back on it, actually had a very disappointing year 2. But probably not quite as disappointing as how Azeez Ojulari's career has turned out. Showed a ton of promise early on, but health has hurt his availability. But even when he's played, he again has just been really inefficient. We mentioned Kayvon Thibodeaux ranking 101st out of 120 eligible pass rushers and pass rush win rate. Azeez Ojulari not too far ahead of him at 92nd. So both these guys just not showing development in terms of their pass rush tool belt and ability to beat the guys in front of them. And that's going to be critical for them next year. I think they have to kind of trust these guys in their development and focus on other disparities in their roster. But you're not going to get Wink Martindale scheming these guys up with the blitzes and the stunts and all that stuff that he loves to run. And on one hand, that might work in their favor where they're getting more opportunities to win one-on-one opportunities and develop that skill set. But on the flip side, if they don't, you're going to witness this being a really painful pass rush, at least off the edge. And it shouldn't be this difficult when you have Dexter Lawrence demanding double teams on the inside. So definitely something to focus on for the Giants next year when we're watching these guys, because I do think at least Thibodeaux, it'll be a lot more Thibodeaux. Ojulari, we'll see. They might need to bring someone else in just from a durability standpoint. But once you get past that edge group, this defense has done some really nice stuff this year, especially with those linebackers. Micah McFadden, I think, has certainly earned to be the starter heading into year 3 here. He's just made a ton of splash plays, and that's exactly what he did in college. Now, his down-to-down consistency struggled in college. It's why he fell to like the 5th or 6th round or whatever. And that's shown up still here with the Giants. There's plays where he's just out of position and giving up coverage busts and missing a bunch of tackles, trying to fly to the ball too fast. In fact, that's the biggest thing you're going to look for him next year is he missed over 20% of his tackle attempts this year. That's a huge problem. Got to clean that up if he's going to hold on to this job long term. But just 24 years old, and he's an athletic guy. He's got good upside. So as a linebacker 2, next to a guy like Bobby Okereke, I think there's some reason to be potentially excited about Micah McFadden. But Bobby Okereke has been a lifesaver for this defense. And you just got to celebrate. Anytime you sign a guy that a team was willing to let leave and he comes in and has a career year for you, that's always a huge win. And that's exactly what's happened with Bobby Okereke, who was, a very solid to good linebacker for Indianapolis and has been a good to great linebacker for the Giants. The biggest thing for him was kind of like we talked about with McFadden, but to a less exaggerated degree, cleaning up those missed tackles. He dropped his missed tackle rate by a good 5% this year. But he's been all over the field in coverage from week to week as well. He had 5 pass breakups, 2 interceptions this year. His total yards allowed in coverage dropped in half from what it was really the last 3 years in Indianapolis. That was a big thing with him, is he's been athletic, but he hasn't been able to quite get to the ball. And for whatever reason this year for the Giants, he's been stickier in coverage and getting his hands on some more footballs. So he's been fantastic. Then you get to the secondary. They've shuffled a lot of pieces around, especially at corner, trying to find some answers, and they haven't found a lot. But Nick McLeod at the very end of the year did kind of get back on the field, and Nick McLeod's interesting because he played a pretty good bit in that 2022 season and had some just hideous performances as an undrafted year 2 corner out of Notre Dame, but had some decent ones in there as well. And this year, he wasn't starting because of those hideous performances, but he's had to play, and he's, made some decent plays out there. Had a really nice interception against Washington in week 11. And then again, basically started or rotated as kind of a dime or nickel corner for the last 3 weeks of the season. And got tested, but didn't give up anything too major in coverage. So don't need to go too far with Nick McLeod here, but hanging around here for the Giants. But then these safeties, I mentioned none other than Dexter Lawrence for star of the season, but Xavier McKinney, looking back on it, ended up with an exceptional safety season, like a Pro Bowl level season for sure. Probably another one of these safeties that, with all due respect to Budda Baker, probably should have been put in instead of Budda Baker. But hey, Budda's got a cool name and was really good like 3 years ago, so that's why we vote Budda Baker into the Pro Bowl. But no, Xavier McKinney ended up with 3 picks on the season, but was third in total tackles for safeties in the NFL, but did that with just a 5% missed tackle percentage. That's about as damn good as you'll see at the safety position. In fact, if you're sorting by total tackles, again, Xavier McKinney had the 3rd most tackles in the league at 94. You've got to go all the way down to Taylor Rapp, who was 77th in the NFL with 31 tackles at safety. You've got to go all the way down that far to find a guy that had under 6% missed tackle percentage. These Alabama guys, like Brian Branch comes to mind too, like their ability to tackle despite being defensive backs is really spectacular. But he made some huge coverage plays and certainly had a career year. Gotta give our love to Xavier McKinney. But then his running mate, Jason Pinnock, made a ton of sense to kind of be chosen as a starting safety in this Wink Martindale system, because that second safety is going to be running a lot of man coverage, buzzing down with all of those blitzes. And Jason Pinnock was a cornerback at Pittsburgh, and I liked his cornerback tape, not going to lie, but he has made that transition to safety now here for the Giants and has settled in. He hasn't been sensational or anything, but considering he's still learning the position, he's made some plays, he's made a presence as a run defender, and overall just might be a guy worth starting again next year with some of the growth he's shown. And then just one last guy here I have a note on, and that's Deonte Banks, the rookie cornerback, who was one of my favorites in this draft class. I just want to say he finished the year playing really well. I'm not going to bump him up because he is a guy that I'm really high on, and he did have some hiccup games in there this year. But I think you do look at the way he finished the year, and you can certainly hope for a breakout year next year for him to kind of emerge as this team's kind of high-end number 1 corner. I definitely think he has it in him. So we don't want to raise him, but I did want to give him a little bit of love here. And that is going to do it for today's division. Thank you so much for watching. If you could, please hit that like button on the way out. It does help me out. Let me know in the comments down below where you agree. Which players do you disagree or think I omitted from your favorite teams? Let me know all of it in the comments down below. But until next time, peace out.